Okay, so Festinger would say the more information people have about an ability, the less interested they should be in comparing themselves to others. They know themselves. There is no need for them to compare themselves. So we can ask, does having objective information always reduce our drive to compare ourselves to others? So there's a study here that followed up on this exact question. In this study, around about 60 female students participated in a study on driving safety, ostensibly, and they completed a questionnaire that was supposed to assess how good of a driver they were. They got some false feedback that they had a 20% chance of causing a car accident. And this is the objective information, just saying, okay, there's a 20% chance of you causing an accident. And then there was a manipulation of the comparison information given to them. So either they were told that this makes them safer than average. They were told that the average risk for a woman their age of causing a car accident was actually 30%. Or they were told that they're actually riskier than average. They were told that the average risk for a woman their age to cause a car accident was only 10%. Or they were in a control group where they got no further information. So the measure or dependent variable here was whether participants would like to see how others scored, and it's the percentage. So let's see what we have. We have as data here the percentage of participants requesting comparison information depending on our three conditions. So the control group, there was no average given, the riskier than average group, and the safer than average group. And what we see here is that in the control group, around about half of participants wanted more information. In the riskier than average group, more than half of participants wanted more information. And in the safer than average group, a small percentage of participants wanted additional information. Now, why is that? Additional information might sometimes trigger desire for comparing yourself despite some absolute information that you already have, like objective information that you already have. It can reduce the desire for getting objective information can actually reduce our desire to socially compare ourselves, but only if we feel ourselves to be in a favorable position. So if we feel like we're actually doing quite well, we don't have the need to further search out information about our performance. So you could say if you wanted to be a little bit blasé about this, even the absolute objective information still is kind of relative, because it depends on whether you're better off than others or you're worse off than others. We can also ask ourselves whether the direction of comparison actually matters. So you can compare yourselves to other people in two ways, right? You can compare yourselves upwards, so to people who are better off than you, or you compare yourself downwards to people who are worse off than you. Now the question is, under which conditions people will choose to compare themselves upwards or downwards. And here we can consult some theory that would say, well, why do we even compare ourselves with others? This theory by Wood would posit three potential pieces of explanation. First, that comparison has something to do with our self-evaluation. We want reliable information about ourselves, so we want to know about similar others. Second, we might want to feel like we want to make ourselves get better. We want to work on ourselves. We want to improve ourselves. And for that, it makes sense to compare ourselves upward. So we can kind of take a look at the goal of our comparisons. And lastly, we might want to just make ourselves feel good about ourselves without actually improving. And this would be a reason for comparing ourselves downwards. So self-enhancement would be a reason for downward comparisons. What goes along with this is this question. So if we were in the classroom now, I would ask you all to raise your hands if you think that you are a better than average cyclist. And I think this usually doesn't fail because almost everyone thinks they're better than average, which in itself, it's impossible that this is true because then, the average must be much higher. But most of us actually do think that we are generally better than average, so which is impossible. There is a difference in whether in the kind of domains where we consider ourselves just better than average on average. And this tendency happens more when we're talking about kind of rather subjective and ambiguous dimensions like being kind, as compared to more objective dimensions like intelligence. And here take objective with a grain of salt, but that's why I'll say dimensions that appear more or less objective. Okay, often better than average attributes are actually considered more important, so we can actually feel better about ourselves because we think that this category that we're really good in, that's also something that's really important for our lives and our social interactions. So you could say that this plays into the direction of social comparisons and makes us to make us feel better, and this would be evidence for the idea that there's self-enhancement going on. So let's talk a bit more about self-enhancement. We strategically compare ourselves to people who are worse off, because if our self-esteem is threatened, then we are motivated to make downward social comparisons to reach a more positive evaluation of ourselves. And there are two routes that we can choose to get this more positive evaluation of ourselves. We can either say, I'm better or better off than someone else. This would be a classical downward comparison. Tom or whoever got an even lower grade on the test than I did. That's what this would look like. And the second route to gaining more positive evaluations of the self would not be doing a social comparison, but to compare ourselves against a hypothetical that it could have also happened. And this is what we would call a counterfactual. So basically this route is taking a downward counterfactual and saying, well, I am better or better off than I could have been. So it's better this way than what could have happened otherwise. Like this is saying like, okay, well, I got 6 points on this test, but I could have also failed the test. So it's basically a comparison against your hypothetical self. Because comparisons always entail one relatively superior individual and one relatively inferior individual. So both ways, comparisons actually can have some costs. When we are the inferior individual, then we might have fear of others' reactions in public. So we might be fearful that others make fun of us or take pity on us. We might also have some fear of our own private feelings, like feeling more negatively, having a negative self-image. And when we are in the role of the of the superior being, then we might be worried that we make other people feel bad because we might make them jealous, for instance. And we might even get worried that we have difficult interactions with people who are potentially jealous or that winners and losers don't get along well. So because of these kinds of costs, it is possible that there might even be norms against public comparisons, at least. For instance, against trash talking people who are worse off. But we can't always control to whom we compare ourselves, and if we do it, sometimes we just have to face others who are better off than we are. So what actually happens when we are exposed to others that are superior, and how does enforced upward social comparison affect our self-view? Let's take a look at some research. So we can consult here the self-evaluation maintenance model. And this model stipulates that one's self-concept can be threatened by others' superior performances. So the impact on the self depends on how close, again, the person that we're comparing ourselves to is, and whether the domain in which we're comparing ourselves to them is actually relevant to our self-concept. This self-evaluation maintenance model by Tesser would stipulate that comparing yourself to a close superior other may have positive or negative effects depending on the domain relevance. If the domain is not relevant, there is no threat. So you can kind of bask in the reflected glory of what your friend or the similar person achieved. But if the domain is relevant to you, then this might feel threatening and you might feel deflated and like you are not good enough. So basically this would mean that when we feel threatened because our domain in which the performance comparison occurs is actually relevant, that is the point when we would try to reduce the threat. And there are multiple routes, again, how this could occur. So one of them could be that we try to distance ourselves from the superior other, that we try to reduce the relevance of the domain, so just tell ourselves that it doesn't really matter to us, or that we try to minimize or even sabotage the other person's performance. And here is some evidence about this idea, about the self-evaluation maintenance model. In particular, participants came to the lab with a friend, and in the course of the study, their verbal skills were assessed in a specific task, where either this task was described as relevant, so this described as a valid test of verbal acuity, or as irrelevant, and they were told that it was just a game. Participants were then given some false feedback, which was that they ranked third, and that meant they, in this case, were outperformed by a friend and by a stranger. After that, there was another task where they were given a secret word. In this case, the secret word was grain, and they were asked to give clues to the friend and stranger to help them guess these words. So, for instance, grain. And the clues that participants gave to their friends and the stranger were then ranked in terms of difficulty. So the difficulty of the cue here is our dependent variable. And there were different types of clues that you could give for the word grain. And just as some suggestions here, so some rather easy clues might be saying wheat or corn, and there were a bunch of others, but they're more difficult. Ones would be saying, oh, alfalfa. Someone might not even know what that is, or brook corn, which I have to admit, I've literally never heard about outside of the scope of this lecture. Okay, so if we took the self-evaluation maintenance model and you derive some predictions, we would say that in the low relevance group, participants should help more to bask in the reflected glory, and this would mean that they would give easier cues, especially if the other person is a friend. In the higher relevance condition, however, the social evaluation maintenance model would suggest that participants help less, that means give more difficult cues, to avoid boosting the other's score even more, especially if the other's a friend. So this is quite in contrast to what our common sense prediction would be, right? Because and also some other psychological theories, the common sense prediction would be that one will always help one's friend more than a stranger. But here the prediction is that if the domain is actually highly relevant, the friend will get even less help than the stranger. So let's take a look at the difficulty of the clues. What we have here is the dependent variable, the difficulty of the clues, depending on whether the domain was presented as relevant or irrelevant. And then for friends who were being helped in light blue and strangers being helped in dark blue. And what we see here is that, first of all, the clues that were given were more difficult when the task was described as relevant. So the self-concept here kind of was more threatened, and then people gave generally less helpful clues. And that was also the case for the stranger. And even you can see there's a tiny difference in the direction that we would expect according to the self-evaluation maintenance model, that actually the friend got even more difficult clues than the stranger in this condition. And in the irrelevant condition, people gave easier cues, first of all, and then in particular, they gave easier cues to the friend compared to the stranger. So this would be in line with our expectations from the self-evaluation maintenance model.